Andrew Galway, Managing Director at Sovereign Group, who has a deep expertise in corporate governance, trading, operations, and post-incorporation management. With 40 plus years of experience, Andrew has overseen successfully running businesses across Singapore and Southeast Asia. Thank you, Andrew, for coming for this event.
When expanding into Singapore, choosing the right business structure can have a long-term impact on a company's operations and success. Could you explain the different business structures that companies can consider? Also, based on your experience, which would you typically recommend for European businesses? Also, the third part of this question, what are the common mistakes do companies often make when making this decision?
Thanks, Harpreet. Well, in Singapore, the European companies, as well as other international companies, often consider how they're going to enter the market. And the common idea is to consider, first of all, a rep office or a branch office, a branch of the European company, or to set up a subsidiary of the European subsidiary. And I think a lot of people feel more comfortable, perhaps if they're unsure about the market, to look at the branch as potentially the easiest step to test the market. And that's fine. It does allow sort of relatively quick access into Singapore and a legal base to consider expansion in the region. But there's two parts that we often discuss with the European companies, and one is that these operations, like moving an established European business into Asia under a branch, it doesn't limit any liability, of course. So anything that happens with that expansion into Asia is the liability is held with the parent company, which often makes European companies a little bit nervous that it potentially is preferable from a risk point of view to put the risk into a subsidiary and limit the liability. And another aspect is tax as well. Like, a lot of people like Singapore because of the favourable rate of tax, and that only applies with a separate entity. So a branch, normally any profits made through a branch would be fully taxable back in Europe.
That's very helpful overview, Andrew. It's clear that getting the structure right from start can save a business a lot of challenges later on. Andrew, my next question is to you. Once a business is incorporated in Singapore, ensuring smooth operations and compliance is key. From your experience, what governance practice should European business prioritize, sort of post-incorporation, to stay compliant with Singapore's regulatory framework? And are there any common mistakes that you've seen?
Yeah, well, leading on from what Ivan mentioned earlier about the whole myriad of different challenges that European clients can face moving to Singapore, that's not the case in every country. Some, like for example, in the UK, where we're from, you don't need to appoint a corporate secretary. You can do it yourself. In Singapore, you must appoint a corporate secretary. So the good news is that professional firms like people on this panel, we will help you with that. And what I find is my corporate secretaries, they do much more than just the regulatory statutory filing. Basically, they will help you with immigration. They'll help you with obtaining licenses to operate, and they'll really be sort of a point of contact to help foreign clients to establish themselves in Singapore. So I guess from a corporate governance point of view, what do these corporate secretaries help with? It's a little bit unusual. And there was two things that sprung to mind that European clients tend not to have seen before. One is the register of controllers that we have in Singapore. And the other one is the compliance with having to have a local resident director. Indeed, there's another register called the Register of Nominee Directors, which is often something that most European clients, even the mention of nominee directors make people fairly cautious. So the corporate secretaries will help you navigate this and make sure that that's filed every year to maintain compliance with the Singapore regulations. So just to expand quickly on what those are, the controller is often mistaken from director, because obviously the director's controlling the company. Then you've got this register of controllers, but really it's the controllers to identify who has 25% ownership of the company and control and control is defined as being able to add and replace directors rather than the management of the company. But the big one potentially, and again, we could probably have a whole seminar on this one, is the local resident director. requirement, because sometimes we see European companies that are expanding into the region. They might be sending a team of people here, but they don't want nobody's suitable to be a director of the company. So what do you do? Because the people that are being employed here on employment passes might be quite senior in the firm, but they're not quite suitable to be a director of the company. But yet you need a local director to be, or you can't set up a Singapore subsidiary. This is a challenge people have, and there's almost a whole industry that's established as a result to meet that need, where you can speak to a third party to appoint a local director to satisfy that need. But that has been that's something that needs advice. It needs to be taken carefully, and has been subject to more regulation recently in Singapore. So that's something that something needs to be monitored carefully. Like, so some mistakes that are made is sometimes senior people are appointed. Like, so a local resident director can be a Singaporean national or PR, or a foreigner that joins as an EP, an employment pass. But sometimes, like European clients, will get an employment pass, but they won't actually live in Singapore, and they'll still be based in Europe, and they'll put themselves as a local resident director, thinking that's fine, but actually that's not fine. Like if the authorities are aware of that, they'll not be overly happy. It should be someone that's living in Singapore. So that's potentially a mistake that's sometimes made.
That's a really great point, and very insightful about the local appointment of local directors and nominee directors. Businesses need not to only set up their business, but they also need to be sure that they stay compliant as they scale.
Andrew, probably you can throw some light on tax systems and capital gain and corporate tax. This comes from the audience. So probably just one or two liners that you can probably add to what Ivan has been talking about.
Yeah, I was looking through some of the questions that came in, and that one did spring to mind, actually, which is something we talk quite a lot about. Singapore doesn't have capital gains tax, and still doesn't have capital gains tax. But at the start of this year, in compliance with sort of EU legislation, there was a tax code that was slipped in to the corporate tax system called 10L. And 10L, it is applicable to European clients that are thinking about investing in Singapore, in the sense that if they set up a Singapore company, which then holds an offshore asset, so say, for example, set up a Singapore company and that invests in a significant asset in Australia, say a solar farm or something like this, if you don't have any substance in Singapore, then, if you basically sell that offshore asset and remit the funds to Singapore, then it's caught by 10L, which basically means the gain can be subject to corporate tax at the rate of 17%. So effectively bringing in a kind of capital gains tax. So that's obviously something that needs to be planned around. Like, obviously the best thing is to have substance in Singapore adequate to deal with 10L, because really that's what it's about. But, sometimes substance is something that, may or may not be able to do. So there's various things we can do around that. But I think that, one needs to also remind itself of the corporate tax system in Singapore, which is source and remittance based. So I'm not going to go into that too much, but the system compared to some global tax systems is very straightforward. So that the premise is source was the gain attributed to activity in Singapore, and then the second part was did you remit the funds to Singapore? So with this capital gains 10L situation, one thing to look at is, can you put substance in Singapore? And then the other consideration is, will you remit the gain into Singapore as well? And these are two things that can be considered to try and plan around that. But so that's what I would add about that some planning definitely needs to be considered when making these types of investments through a Singapore holdco.